Good evening, everyone. My name is Miles Thurlow, and I'm the co-founder of Workplace Foundation, which is a charity set up by Workplace Gallery to support emerging and underrepresented artists based in the north of England. This week, artist Magnus Quaife will be in conversation with Andrew Hunt, Professor of Fine Art and Curating at Manchester Metropolitan University. Magnus Quaife's practice has been described as that of a conceptual artist interested in paint and has been connected through an approach that is akin to an archaeology of the modern and the contemporary. The defining aspect of his recent work in which these concerns have been explored is a visually playful exploration of the connection between the painted mark, the frozen gesture, and the representation or equivalent of that gesture in other media or materials. Magnus Quaife has exhibited internationally and across the UK, and his work is in private and public collections nationally. Born in 1975 in Nottingham, he lives and works in Greater Manchester. Andrew Hunt is a curator and a writer based in London and Manchester and is currently Professor of Fine Art and Curating at Manchester Metropolitan University. From 2008 to 2014, he was Director of Focal Point Gallery in Southend-on-Sea, where he was responsible for developing the organisation's acclaimed exhibitions programme and publishing activities. Since the early 2000s, he worked on intimate solo exhibitions with significant international artists such as Mike Nelson, Elizabeth Price, Tris Vonner Mitchell, Mark Camille Shamovitz, and in 2012 he was a member of the Turner Prize jury. He's contributed to magazines and journals such as Art Forum, Art Monthly, the Burlington Magazine, Frieze, Moose Magazine and Tate, etc., and is a founding editor of the Slim Volume imprint, which to date has published editions and books by over 250 artists. So as usual, we'll try to make time at the end for questions. If you could make use of the Q&A function on Zoom, which is down the bottom, then I'll try and interrupt Magnus and Andy brutally at the end. So, welcome Magnus. Here we go, you should be appearing any second. There we go. Hi Magnus.
Hi.
And welcome Andy. Andy, where are you? Hello.
Hello.
Hello, hello. And I am going to disappear, as usual, into the background, and I'll put up some images and I'll interrupt you soon. So enjoy, take care.
Okay, thanks, Miles. Well, what I wanted to say was, first of all, thanks for joining us. It's a real pleasure to talk to Magnus today. One of the things I wanted to mention first of all is that I'm really used to interviewing artists on painting because I'm just currently, this isn't a plug, but I'm currently working on a book and I've interviewed around 40 artists. This is a time thing, by the way, for a book that's going to come out on interviews with contemporary painters, and it involves curators and writers as well. So what I've tried to do is organise it so that we've got the right amount of questions for the right amount of time looking at Magnus's work. So I've only got 10 questions, and rather than waffle, which I'm doing now, I'm going to stop in a minute. I'm just going to read them out, and there might be time for riffing and kind of looking at secondary questions between these questions. So I'm just going to read them out and see what Magnus has to say, which I think will be really interesting. And in the background, we're going to have a lot of pictures from Magnus's work playing, so that you can see what we're talking about. Okay, so on to the first question. I wanted to look at the context of this talk. So the intro to this talk says that we're going, this is for you, Magnus. The intro to this talk says that we're going to unpick the relationship between haptic, indexical marks, in quotation marks, made by painters and their reproduced equivalent. So first of all, can you tell me what you interpret, how you interpret these first two terms, haptic and indexical, as meaning, and what do they mean for you in terms of the making of your work?
Yeah, I suppose I think of the haptic in terms of in painting, at least, of the visual relating to a sense of touch. And so thinking about the kind of gesture that is made through the application of paint, and that provoking in the mind of the viewer a kind of haptic sensation, I suppose. And then in terms of indexical, Isabella Graw talks about that gesture. She kind of turns the idea of the photograph as the index par excellence, I suppose, and turns it on its head, and talks about painting being the perfect medium for indexicality, because it is the index of the presence of the artist. The mark or the gesture in the painting is the index or the presence of the artist. So the painting that we're starting with, that we're looking at now, probably the only one that's in the right order in the whole talk, actually, is a painting from about 4 or 5 years ago. I suppose it was exhibited 2017, I think. No, I can't remember. Maybe it was earlier than that. Maybe it was 2016. And it's about 7.5 foot square, and it involves, there were 2 paintings the same size, and the marks on it, the kind of gestural marks on it, are decollaged from a poster of Cy Twombly's work from the Moderna Museum. So the things that appear, I suppose, on first glance, it doesn't hold up an illusion in any way. It doesn't kind of, you're not looking at it for a long time thinking that they're painted marks, because they have that kind of shininess and printed quality. But they form the kind of the figure of the painting, I suppose. So they're the kind of gestural marks in the foreground of the painting. Whereas actually my presence as a painter, I suppose there's decisions about where those things went to some extent, but it was done fairly quickly, is actually in the background. And we'll get to some images of it where you can see that the paint was laid on very, very thickly. I had to get several litres of white oil paint made for the 2 paintings. And then it was dragged across with a saw, and leaving a kind of ridged element. And that's the presence of my hand in it. So there's a kind of reversal of what Graw talks about as being indexical, which here might be the mark of Cy Twombly. It's taken from another painter. It's not my own. It's not my own mark within these works. Yeah, and they were put in one painting, the big white painting, and then they were taken out and put into this painting. So there's a kind of the gesture is almost the ghost in the first painting.
Okay, just to problematize that a little bit, in terms of the index or indexical marks. My second question, and this is kind of like, I guess it goes to the heart of perhaps certain issues with Isabella Graw's writing and this idea of irony, but that you kind of an irony in painting and critical painting and late postmodern painting, as opposed to humour and experimental kind of gesture. But I guess I'll just read it out. Secondly, how and why do you make a reproduced equivalent to these indexical marks to provide your own configuration of meaning, or to open up new interpretations? For example, an artist who has recently been critical of indexical practices is Alistair McInvan, who previously used predetermined references, but now simply paints with no a priori motive, theory, or set of ideas. Can you tell me if you're in one camp or on the other, or if you're somewhere in between?
Yeah, I don't think I'm in a camp with it to some extent. I suppose these works have emerged. The Castlefield show was part of their series of exhibitions, which are called head exhibitions, where they get an artist who's maybe less established, in this case that was me, to exhibit alongside a more established artist and see if something kind of productive emerges from that, I suppose. Even though I suppose the idea of being head-to-head sounds a little bit competitive, I don't think that's the way that it's intended. And not the current curator, but the previous curator, Doris Quaife, had been talking to me about perhaps doing one of these. And I kind of thought, actually, maybe all the artists that I wanted to exhibit with were probably weren't really going to, I don't know because I didn't ask them, but maybe they weren't going to do a show at the Castlefield Gallery with me. And so I started to think about how that format might be reinvented. And I came up with the idea of doing it with a theorist or philosopher rather than doing it with an artist. And so I kind of made this, I had a chance to talk to the then director, Kwong Lee, about the idea for the show. And I kind of quite hurriedly mentioned this idea and suggested doing it with Roland Barthes. And so then there were some happy things that happened, you know, that discovering Roland Barthes' hobby watercolor paintings, for example, and then starting to think about Barthes as sorry, a crack of thunder has just gone off in the background and distracted me a little bit. But starting to think about Barthes' application of close reading and thinking that in relation to other painters' works. So here in this series of works, I suppose to some extent there was some theory that was a priori, you know, that came before the making of the work. But it wasn't really about painting. I was reading Roland Barthes talking about Cy Twombly, but actually in a fairly critical way. Because one of the things that he doesn't do is to talk about the surface quality of the painting. And it's been said that actually he wrote most of his stuff about painting from looking at books. You know, he wasn't really thinking about the kind of physical quality of the paint itself at all. So the ideas about indexicality as a way of framing the things that emerge from that, this kind of taking apart and close reading of Cy Twombly and this reversal of the surface in relation to the way that Barthes was talking about painting. The idea of framing that in terms of indexicality are not a priori. They came afterwards. You know, it's something that kind of emerged in the work, and then there were ideas that I read after that, I think, probably, but certainly if it wasn't after it, they weren't at the fore of my mind in making the work. So I think the work is a response to a set of interests, probably in the same way that a lot of painters do. They have a set of interests, they take them to the studio, and then there's this process of kind of thinking about them, playing with them. And it was actually 3 years in production, this show, but actually the vast majority of things are made will never be seen. They're not, you know, it's a process of working through. And sometimes that's done with theory very much in mind, and sometimes it's without it in the studio. There's a guy, there's an American phenomenologist called Mark Vogel, and he talks about, so I think he kind of does social research, but uses phenomenological methods. And he talks about where philosophy is situated in relation to his practice. And he talks about this idea of it being at 30,000 feet. And so it's always there and it's always present, but it's not actually the thing that you're always dealing with when you're on the ground doing the work, if that makes sense.
Oh, really, that's a great answer. I've got a really long question for you now, so bear with me. It's to do with political history and cultural history on an international, but on a very local level. So I'll just start reading this. For While England Mourns, which was a title of one of your shows, you used a well-known situationist poster containing an image of a young woman throwing a cobblestone at the viewer as the main motif for a series of paintings. In the catalogue essay for the show, I wrote the following passage about the legacy of situationist practice in popular culture, in quotes. Manchester's own situationist pop moment came via Factory and the Hacienda. It was a long catalyst for cultural change in the north of England. Although Factory gave up the ghost in 1992, the effects of the record label and the Situationist International's theory still reverberate in the city. In part, however, Wilson's famous phrase, "This is Manchester, we do things differently here," has become a corporate driver for regeneration. Within the context of Brexit, one could argue it reads as an insular resistance to change, a variation on the curmudgeonly northern caricature epitomised by the phrase, "There's nowt wrong with round here," opposed to the easy nature of Mancunian lateral free thinking within the history of the city's continued proud proclamation of independence. So this is a question, can you tell me about your show in 2018 based on the Situationist International at Touchstones in Rochdale in terms of the 50th anniversary of May 68, as well as the local connection with the UK and Manchester through the Northern English caricaturist and satirical poet Tim Bobbin?
Yeah, it's almost where to start with that one, Andy. I think the first thing that kind of chimed a chord with me was the kind of Tony Wilson idea. You know, the idea of this is Manchester, we do things differently here, and that kind of being, I suppose, subverted towards corporate means as a slogan for redevelopment in Manchester. And I was thinking back to not long before lockdown. It was a nice morning, and I was getting off the train at Piccadilly Station, and I walked kind of around the back streets through the old UMIS campus to the art school. And on the way there, I passed, I think 3 different sites: a building site, a nightclub, and an office that I could see in through the window, that all had that slogan on them somewhere or another. This is Manchester, we do things differently here. And it made me think, well, yeah, but maybe not from each other then. If it's everywhere like that. And I suppose that, you know, the exhibition was kind of in some ways intended to be critical of that redevelopment. So again, it was an exhibition where I was asked to work with something. So it kind of didn't get into it with, it was a very free offer to work with contemporary forward at Touchstones in Rochdale. But they wanted me somehow to work with their collection, and they have stores. I mean, you can see that the gallery spaces are amazing anyway, but on the other side of Rochdale, near the train station, they have stores, and they took me to the stores to look through, and it's on an industrial estate, and I think they have like 4 or 5 of those kind of corrugated metal warehouses, just full of stuff from Rochdale, like the contents of a whole post office, Cyril Smith's chair, which has to be kept under lock and key now, Gracie Field's dresses, a whole collection of Egyptology from some rich guy from Rochdale many years ago. And it's kind of daunting, you know, thinking, well, where do I start with this? You know, what kind of things can I deal with? And as I was walking through, I think there's an image of it later on in one of the slides, but there was a pot head, and it was just weird, and it kind of, there was something about it. I was like, what on earth is this doing in this museum collection? It seemed out of place. The shelves are quite well organized as you walk through, so there are kind of groups of things, and this was there, and I asked what it was, and Mark Doyle, the curator, groaned a little bit and told me that it was Tim Bobbin. And I said, well, why are you groaning? He said, well, because kind of everyone in Rochdale, or everyone who comes to Rochdale, wants to do something about Tim Bobbin. But I'd never heard of this guy, so I went away, I made a note of him, and I went away and I started looking, and he was an 18th century caricaturist and satirist, a very political guy. He was a schoolmaster in Milne, just outside of Rochdale. He was actually called John Collier, but he did his artistic work under the name of Tim Bobbin, and I found out that he called himself the Hogarth of Lancashire, which had this immediate appeal. And one of the things that he did was a series of satirical prints, really kind of pointing fun at everyone in society, but especially the powerful and the rich, the clergy and the politicians and the merchants, but himself a little bit as well. He was very fond of a beer, and he would send himself up for his terrible drinking habits. It was called Human Passions Delineated, and within that book there was one particular poem with an etching that's called While England Mourns, and it talks about politicians lining their chests with gold whilst England mourns. I think it's something like their stomachs with wine and their chest with gold whilst England mourns. And it seemed something, you know, there was something that rang out to me about that, thinking how little maybe has changed. You know, I think there was something that seemed to have a connection to where we are now, and it felt worth more investigation. And the second kind of happy coincidence was that the opening of the exhibition was timed to be in May 2018, which was 50 years after the uprisings in Paris. And of course, you know, there were uprisings all around the world at that point. And it seemed that opportune to make a kind of connection between this work of this little known satirist artist, Tim Bobbin, and then some of the more iconic work from 1968. But the work tried to frame that in a contemporary critical. So all the work is made on PIR board. So it's PIR board, which is the kind of stuff which is used to insulate tower blocks. And you just see all around the city. That's everywhere. You know, Manchester for the past decade has been on a building frenzy, as much of the world has. Although Manchester, kind of proportionally to per capita, there's been more building going on than anywhere in the rest of Europe for the past few years. And this is what you see. You see this kind of stuff clad to the outside of those buildings, that kind of corporate slogan, which has been brought back in. It is being framed, I suppose, on the buildings with this kind of stuff. But then there's also a kind of critique inherent in the work about my own taking of the French revolutionary slogan "La beauté est dans la rue," the beauty is in the street. One, because it kind of provokes the viewer to leave the gallery if they want to see anything beautiful. I think that's something that you mentioned to me as one of the ideas that's kind of inherent in using that slogan. But also, you know, one of the reasons I was interested in using it was because the Atelier Populaire, the students who took over the art school in France, it wasn't just Paris, but also in Marseille and a couple of other places, wrote a statement which was saying that these should not end up in the gallery. You know, they were not kind of aesthetic things. They were designed for a particular purpose, and they didn't want them fetishized as objects of art. And of course, that's to some extent what I'm doing here. Yeah, so the image was repeated across, I think, 8 pieces in the gallery, and then there was one of them which I painted over the top of, which has kind of hidden behind the pink, has an image of the While England Mourns, the Tim Bobbin piece. But then I can't remember which local newspaper it was, but we had the rather unfortunate thing that in their "What's On" section put it down as White England Mourns, which was you know, not really in the spirit of what we were thinking of, I suppose. So we had to get that changed fairly quickly. Does that answer the question, Andy? I kind of forget what the question was. I've been talking that long. Is that?
No, it does. I guess Guy Debord is a bit like Boris Johnson in kind of relationship with Winston Churchill. Guy Debord's our Winston Churchill, isn't he?
Yeah,
in the
maybe.
current way
I
of
don't
looking
really
at
thought of it that way.
Anyway, I'm going to stay with the north of England, sticking with the north of England and painting. We're both part of a group that is loosely called Painting Manchester, which is based at Manchester School of Art and aims to look at the medium of painting in the region of the northwest of England and how this connects to international developments. I just wanted to know if you could speak a little bit about that and how you see yourself within it and how you think it's progressive in some way.
Yeah, so I suppose Painting Manchester, there were quite a few people at Manchester School of Art who are in one way or another interested in painting, whether it's through research or practice or both, or curating. I think it really took you arriving a couple of years ago to kind of get us all together and say, well, maybe there's something that we could do collectively. So certainly myself and Ian Hartshorn have been doing a lot of work around painting pedagogies. And there were numerous other projects going on. We came together and started talking about, you know, how we can frame something which is significant within Manchester that feels relevant and appropriate. And for me, the strength of it, as much as anything else, is putting Manchester within an international critical debate around painting. So we're only a couple of years old, but we've had some really, I think, important figures come and talk about different ideas around painting. And I think it kind of, I think it's too easy to dismiss anywhere in the UK away from London, almost as kind of being provincial and therefore not being able to make a relevant contribution. And I think it, you know, there are loads of really good painters in Manchester at the moment, or who've been in Manchester for significant periods of time and moved on. And I think the same for you know, for most of the regions, but being able to give some visibility or a voice to that through connecting it to a serious level of critical debate around painting, I think has been an important thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I won't say what I think. This is your
Yeah, go on, say what you think, Andy.
No, I think you're completely right. I think it's interesting also just from an international point of view, bypassing London. You don't have to bypass London, but I think the idea of setting up a separate centre, not a regional minor location as a kind of space for painting, but just another centre somewhere else other than the usual centres in Germany and the US and the UK, think is quite interesting. So it's just interesting setting up symposia, but making books, and teaching in that situation with all sorts of talented, interesting people. I'm going to go into the next question, which is about your work. I'm looking at artists, specifically painters, who have got practices, for want of a better word, that embody a whole set of different styles. I just wanted to ask you a question about that, because there aren't really that many. I mean, my reference for someone I've interviewed recently is Lady Churchman, whose work varies immensely from faux naivety to photorealist images of iPhones most recently. So I just wanted to ask, why do you use an eclectic mixture of styles, and who would you use as your current favourite artist working in a similar manner?
Yeah, the favourite artist one's a tough question. I don't know, there's probably lots of them. I don't know if it is, I think historically, I think there's almost, I think there are really good examples of artists who've reinvented themselves or worked through a series of different stylistic approaches, and we might think of as consistent despite that, I suppose. So, I mean, the one that I think is easy to think of is Picasso. And I've got a book, and I can't remember who it's by. I think it's about French painting in the first half of the 20th century. And it goes back into the 19th century. And I think it lists something like 24 different styles and movements of painting in France during that period. And I think Picasso's in 17 of them. I mean, he was kind of moving on quickly and doing different things at quite a pace. And yet there are consistencies, the consistency of his use of the figure. And I suppose when we see a Picasso painting, maybe I think it's more than just how famous they are. I think there's a kind of signature within them. If you Google Picasso, one of the things that comes up fairly quickly is people who've made their own Picassos. And I think you can even tell the ones that are pretty good, you can even tell they're not Picassos, right? It's pretty much straight away. So there's a consistency in his hand within the work. I think that's the case with a lot of artists who are trying to play about stylistically. For me, it was kind of, I suppose, I never really understood the idea that you would find a way of working and continue doing that thing all the time. It felt to me like there are different things in dialogue in the studio, different things that you're interested in, and then perhaps the way that you deal with that thing might have to change or alter, that you can't kind of come up with a single perfect solution. And of course, there are painters who are very kind of singular about the ideas that they're dealing with. But I think that maybe it comes down to being, I'm full of doubt. I'm never absolutely certain. Maybe when I'm making one piece of work, I can be certain about it, but not, it forces me to kind of go and investigate different ideas and try and approach ideas from different angles. And perhaps there's something of that in the painting. But there have been periods, there are periods when I've kind of painted in a similar way for 5 or 6 years. And I have to catch myself and go, hold on a minute, this isn't something that you were really thinking of. And then maybe about 10 years ago, I read a quote from Isaac Enskin, and I thought, that's it, that's what I'm thinking of. This is why I've been trying to approach this, maybe, more or less successfully for a long time now. And she talks about this idea that it's a myth, that you go to art school and you discover who you are as an artist, and then you spend the rest of your life trying to hone that until, and she says, it's always 10 years before you die, you find your master style. And then and then that's it, you're done. And she said, well, that sounds fucking boring. And I kind of agree, it sounds boring. I think it's more interesting to push yourself into different spaces and think about work differently and being consistent. And I suppose I've always had this ambition that maybe one day I'd be able to do a solo exhibition which was kind of coherent and yet not stylistically at all. So every single work is kind of approaching an idea or a way of thinking or a problem or a set of images or whatever it would be, but kind of approaching it differently. And yet I've never managed to do that, because in the studio, in any given moment, I suppose, any period of time, there are things that start to fascinate me, that pull me in, and then, they get dealt with over a period of time. Yeah.
So you've got like, one of the other questions I've got is just looking at, you just been talking about Picasso a few minutes back, but not just different styles, but different subject matter. So for example, you know, you've got the idea of Tim Bobbin with the Situationist International, but I wanted to look at also a different subject for a different exhibition with Cézanne and Close Encounters. So I just wanted to ask you about that, because there's some really unusual combinations of ideas. So can you tell me about your subsequent exhibition? This is in 2014 in Works Projects, which conflated Cézanne's obsession with the mountain in Richard Dreyfuss's, you know, where Richard Dreyfuss played Roy Neary in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, who was an electrical lineman in Indiana, who had a similar encounter with a specific object, a specific form of landscape, as well as an obsession with an unidentified flying object. Sorry, I was kind of stuttering over that question, but can you tell me about that exhibition? You know, it just sounds like, how did you come up with those two kind of ideas? And
yeah, in all honesty, I can't remember where it started. I mean, I know I've kind of been completely, I mean, I love Cézanne. I just think he's was a phenomenal painter. And about, I don't know, 14 years ago, something like that, maybe not quite that long. I think it was 2008 or 2009. I managed to get some money to go to Aix-en-Provence. And my idea was, right, I was going to go to Aix-en-Provence because I've been on the internet, right, and I couldn't find anything that mapped out the sites that Cézanne painted Mont Saint-Victoire from. So, you know, I've been to libraries, I tried to find different stuff. And I managed to go to Aix-en-Provence for about a week and a half, I think it was. We were, yeah, I say we, the plan was to walk around Mont Saint-Victoire on the side that Cézanne lived on the X side, and find the spots that he painted it from. And I didn't know, I had no idea where I was staying. I booked this place because it was cheap, it was out of season, and two, because it was called the Jardin de Buffon, and that was the name of his family home. But I kind of, you know, anyway, it was nowhere near it. It was kind of like miles away and in the middle of nowhere, and I couldn't work out how to get there. So I went into the tourist office in the centre of Aix, and I asked them how to get there, and they wrote down the number of the bus and said, you get off here when you see this, and then it's about 2 minutes walk, etc. And he said, is there anything else I can help you with? And I said, well, I doubt it. What I've done, I've come here to try and find the sites that Cézanne painted Mont Saint-Victoire from. And he said, what? Oh, give me a minute. And he walked off and he went into the back somewhere. And he was gone for ages. And he found this ancient, like, well, I say ancient, you know, kind of like, I guess it was from the 70s, judging by the graphic design, although that might have been the 90s in France. Am I allowed to say that? I don't know. Anyway, and this map, this kind of old dusty map, the last copy that they had, was a map of the sites that Cézanne had painted Mont Saint-Victoire from. So I still, obviously, you know, I still spent the time there. It was just easier to find them. I walked to them, and I spent some time. And the idea was that some work would emerge from that, and it didn't. You know, there was nothing. I didn't make anything in response to that experience at the time. But I kept kind of maybe looking more closely at Cézanne, and I think it's obvious. But you know, perhaps this painting. Sorry, it's a collage. It says quite succinctly the idea really that Cézanne painted a bit of cloth in the same way that he painted a mountain. You know, there was no hierarchy of the area of paintings. You know, that's well known. He kind of, an orange was as important as a person. And that became more interesting to me. But there are also certain things, I think, that have increasingly become debunked about Cézanne's character. So there are kind of myths about who Cézanne was and how he behaved and his moodiness, that the more you read into it, you understand this is a kind of, to some extent, it's a construction around the myth of the artist. And that's when, I can't remember how, but the idea of this character of Roy Neary also having this obsession with the mountain starts to emerge. And in the original script for Close Encounters, although I've been told since it wasn't Steven Spielberg bought the script off someone else and then wrote their name off it. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they worked on it together and then he bought him out of it. But it describes the character of Roy Neary as working like a deranged artist. And so clearly, for me, in Spielberg's mind was this idea, this myth of the artist informing this character of Neri and his behaviour as he's making his mashed potato mountains, as he's kind of obsessively working. So the idea was really the central piece in the show, which is a model of Mont Saint-Victoire, was made kind of in the style, I suppose, of the model that Roy Neri makes, right? Using cloths and dirt and just kind of throwing stuff about. So the photograph doesn't do it justice. There was kind of soil and stones around the edges, and then obviously you can't see what's underneath it. But what we tried to do was find furniture which kind of matched up with the stuff in Cézanne's studio. So I spent some time in Cézanne's studio, although the idea there was to photograph the furniture in the studio, but of course you're not allowed to take any photographs. I also went to his parents' house and asked if I could go and look at the rooms where Cézanne would have had as a bedroom when he was a young man, and they said no, there's no point. It's just a concrete shell. Everyone visits for the gardens out the back, but you walk in, and the building's kind of just been shored up with concrete, and there's nothing there. And I tried to explain why I would really like to go and see the rooms, and that was no as well. I wasn't allowed to go and see the rooms. So there was a kind of conflation of these two ideas, but I think there's something about running through the work which is about a myth which underpins a notion of artistic genius, and that somehow emerging from obsession or derangement.
Staying with the idea of like science fiction and theory, I'm being a bit silly here. There are so many theories of painting around at the moment. This is second from last question. What's your favourite and your least favourite? And which is more like the most like science fiction?
I really, I don't know if it's difficult to think about. I didn't really answer the question about a favourite artist working in different styles earlier. Difficult to, well, I didn't answer it at all. Difficult to think about a favourite theory as well. But I suppose I've been watching recently a few videos of Jan Verwoerd talking about painting. And I really like it. There's a couple of different versions of the talk on YouTube, and there are two ideas that kind of emerge. I mean, maybe kind of listening to my bio at the beginning where Miles was talking about a conceptual artist who paints, which is how I have been described. But it kind of reminds me of that joke that Jan Verwoerd made, which is why a conceptual artist painting again? Because they think it's a good idea. And then the other joke that he made.
There was one talk where he got a synthesizer out and started comparing the rhythm of painting to the rhythm of music. And
it's the idea of oscillation, that paint oscillates between different kind of states and ideas, I think. And he's using a Roland 303 drum machine and kind of oscillates using the oscillation controls on it, and talking about as a way to illustrate this idea of painting oscillating. And then he talks about the idea of God, what's the word that he uses? I can't remember now. But the proximity of painting to other things. I don't know. Painting situates itself closely to other things and can be in conversation with kind of modernism, but also the kind of pink on an album cover at the same time. And I think there's a kind of charm in the way that he's talking about that. There's a kind of, he keeps it, he talks very seriously about painting, but he opens it up in very interesting ways. And I think what he's talking about isn't kind of a million miles away from perhaps what the idea of painting being beside itself, that David Joslet essay. And yet he kind of frames it in a way which allows painting to feel playful and not academic, I suppose. So that's something I'm really interested in. Least favorite theories.
You don't have to say.
No, well, okay. I'll just say there's a book, and I think it's called "Philosophers Write About Painting" or something. I think it's a Routledge book from about 10 years ago. Take your pick. Take your pick of any of the essays in there. It's like I don't know. I think quite often when philosophers write about painting, they use it to illustrate philosophy rather than really dealing with painting and the state of painting. Not all the time, but quite often.
Yeah, I guess it's a classic revenge, attempted revenge of philosophy on art through criticism as a way of completing art. It always fails, mostly. I've got a few more questions, but I just wanted, I think we're sort of, let's see how we're doing for time. Hold on. I wanted to ask you, let's see if I go back a bit. Bear with me, sorry. Yeah, can you tell me, this is a sidestep, it's not really about painting, but could you tell me about your curatorial activity? Because you have organised quite a few exhibitions.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, it's all very much artist-led, but I think I've worked with different people, so quite often I collaborate with one or more people running spaces or ideas, and it's something I started doing at art school, just really interested. I think it's kind of always been driven by this idea that if there's something you want to see, don't wait for it to be shown. You know, don't wait for a show to come around, or for that artist that you're really interested in to have a show, or that kind of idea for a group show for someone more experienced or able to do it. Just find ways of doing it. And so, yeah, I mean, some of the most interesting projects that I've done were with that for a few years. I worked with Stuart Ebenson, who lives down in, I'm probably going to get it wrong, but I think Devon now. It's Devon, not Dorset. You think he's here, so you know he can correct me you can send a question and correct me if I'm wrong. But he lives down in Devon. But we worked. We ran an artist-led. It's not really a space. It was called the Blackpool Museum of Contemporary Art. We like this idea, the kind of grandness of calling yourself a museum of contemporary art, but having no fixed abode. We borrowed spaces and organised events in Blackpool for a couple of years, and then the other, I suppose, space that I think was most interesting was in Manchester, in the same building as Rogue Studios, which was an old cotton mill. I think it had different kind of lives. It was a knitting mill as well by the time we were in there, and before that they'd made towels in there. And it had an old showroom, and the floor with the showroom became available, and I managed to take over the showroom to run it as a gallery space for a couple of years. Again, doing it as kind of pretty much on the cheap, really. And I say we because I worked closely with Helen Collett, who has gone on to do all sorts of interesting things with wine and music, and you know, lots of things. But yeah, it was kind of this idea. Actually, I think at the time, I think Manchester kind of fluctuates between having some really interesting artist-led spaces and then none at all. And it kind of felt like maybe some more stuff should just be happening in Manchester. Maybe some artists should be doing some stuff. And then a lot of people came in and curated stuff there. So Paul Cordwell curated a really interesting exhibition called Sculpture is a Vulture Nibbling on the Entrails of the Mundane. And I did a show called Zombie Modernism, and I did one called Shit Show, which was kind of framed around George Barber's video piece. I was once involved in a shit show, which is great if anyone's not seen it and you want to understand what the artist-led is all about. That George Barber describes it beautifully. But there were kind of opportunities to do exciting things. Then I would give them, you know, where possible, just give them these grand titles. So they sound, you know, Margras and Odette are the two art dealers in The Masterpiece by Zola. But it kind of sounds like Pace Wildenstein or A House from Worth. So it's meant to sound like, you know, if someone was talking about it, it had that kind of gravitas. But in the reality, it was in a crumbling mill in the arse end of Manchester city centre. Yeah, so it kind of defied its reality.
Last question: what are you working on at the moment, and is it in Manchester or further afield, or are you expanding into international curating at all?
Yeah, no, I'm not expanding into international curating. I'm working, so I've been program leader on the undergraduate fine art degree at Manchester for 2 years now, and that's sucked up quite a bit of my energy. But the intention is to have a little bit of a rebalance over the next year, and starting very soon being in the studio more. So sat in the corner of this room, I have a stack of stretchers that I've ordered from Holland and some new paints. And yeah, the idea is to get back into the studio, and I've been making some drawings and thinking about what that might be. And I suppose I have a backlog of 2 years of ideas that have really just not been dealt with in anything but a very basic way. So I suppose it's kind of the initial stage is getting into the studio and trying to think about which of those are actually going to work when it comes to me. And some ideas from even longer ago, you know. So I bought a pair of Ralph Lauren jeans that are pre-painted to look as if they're meant to look. So they're women's jeans that are meant to look as if you've stolen them off your boyfriend. And these particular range, which I think are called Astor, are meant in the boyfriend's jean range, are meant to look as if your boyfriend's an artist and you've stolen his jeans. So I actually have 2 pairs of them that have been sat in my studio for about 4 years whilst I try and work out exactly what I do with them, which in the end might be nothing. But they seem like this, in that kind of idea of connecting to the idea of the indexical mark. When that indexical mark is made in a factory in Mexico and ends up on a pair of jeans as a fashion icon, there's something in there, right?
Sounds like an idea Merlin Carpenter might have.
Yeah, well, I don't think that's an insult.
Anyway, here's Miles. Should we hand it over to the audience, Miles?
Yeah, absolutely. That was I could just listen to you guys for ages. I'm really enjoying it. We've got quite a few questions, so I'm going to sort of power through them in no particular order. I might anonymise some of them. Well, maybe no. Why do I need to do that? Andrew Bracey. Hi, Miles. Hope all is well. Here is my question for later. It's to Magnus about appropriation and to ask whether everything is open to him to use as material for his work, or are there things that are off limits, and if so, what might these be? Did you get that, Magnus?
Yeah, I did. I'm just having a little think about that because I think there's nothing off limits, I don't think, but there's things that I wouldn't want to use. So I don't kind of maybe it's kind of the fact that this talk was postponed, should I say, sorry, 2 weeks ago for Blackout Tuesday. I don't think I've ever appropriated images or works that feel to me that would be kind of racially, ethically, culturally inappropriate in that way. Don't think I've ever done that. Maybe don't think so. And so there's certain things that I don't see the value of or I see some things I don't see the value in appropriating, and other things I suppose I don't. I think that they're not mine to appropriate, but if I wanted to, I could. It's not that they're off limits; it's that there are kind of boundaries that I might set for myself around what I'm interested in, or what I think is valid to deal with.
Thanks for that. I've got a question here from Brian Fay. Hi, great conversation. Does your discussion on indexicality in painting also apply to drawing, or is that a separate discourse?
I think Isabella Groh talks about other things, but she does say really that it is painting which is the most appropriate medium, because I think she says it's where we understand it most. So my kind of questioning around that is when we see a sculpture made of clay and we can see the thumbprint of the sculptor in that, why would that not have an equivalence to the gesture of the painter? I'm not sure. I don't get that bit of Isabella Groh particularly. But perhaps she's talking in a bigger term. The mark of the painter is always present somehow. But she also goes on to say that that's the case when it isn't, right? So I've just said it's always present, but I think she's talking about expanded field painting, for example, that says we understand it in the same way because it's still painting. So I don't know how tenuous that is. I'm not sure. I'm not going to try and defend that idea. I think it's problematic.
I think the other side of the coin is the process of painting. In painting, if you're not going from kind of previous reference points, if you want to put it like that, and like different an index of reference points. It's far more risky in some respects, I think, because you're playing with the idea of genius and the horrors of that. So if you're just painting, like I think this is why Alistair McKinven's very interested in it, because he just paints from nothing. And if something comes up like that he really likes, he'll paint it out, and it's a kind of this idea of negative. It's just erasure of everything until something finally comes up that looks as if it's new, not even from some bizarre kind of intuition of what your knowledge has accumulated subconsciously or whatever over time. So again, that's I guess that's the alternative in painting to this idea of ironic postmodernism of just everything is just a symbol of something else, and it could be a constellation of new symbols, which has new, in combination, which has a new meaning. But in drawing, I don't know, that's interesting, because the whole idea of erasure and what's the name, Magnus? Where you're kind of constantly erasing.
Like a palimpsest?
No, it's not palimpsest. It's this idea of it's almost like it's got guilty associations. So you're absolutely horrified with what you've made. So you keep. It's kind of it's got Catholic kind of references, but yeah, it's this idea of like guiltily erasing everything that you're afraid that you've made until something like really good comes out. And I think it's like painting is much more easy to do because you're able to play with the surface and erase and add, whereas drawing, you can just tear up the surface of the paper, can't you? So it's harder to do.
What's the word, Andy?
Hold on, I'll find it. You talk amongst yourselves. I'll Google it. Hold on.
A question here from Neil Rock. In light of the discussion being moved for Blackout Tuesday, and as two white British men talking together, how important do you think it is to question the canon in both pedagogy and practice? And after postmodernism, how does value coalesce in light of this?
I'll stop Googling. This is more important. I totally agree. Earlier this week, I had a conversation with Cedar Lewison, who's a Black curator, talking about his situation as he works for the South Bank Centre and has been furloughed. And we were talking about another writer, Black writer, and we were talking about the problems even of the kind of phrase BAME from their point of view. And there's just so many different problems within the British art establishment. The whole idea of decolonizing as a easy buzzword for diversity, the fact that the establishment of all of the galleries and the Arts Council and the DCMS and the government is intricately linked, about kind of issues. I mean, for me, about issues of inequality. I've just written an article for Art Monthly about this. So, for example, one of the things, I could go on forever about this. It's not just about the Black situation; it's about class in general. The history of the kind of Victorian officer class, which still runs a British contemporary art establishment. It's a kind of oxymoron. It's duplicitous. It's the last bastion of inequality dressed up as liberty. And so the amount of virtue signalling that's gone on since lockdown, which has turned into, protest after the killing in America by the police, is really interesting because if you look in a specific local context in the UK, not one British publicly funded art institution has criticised the government for its handling of COVID. But they have criticised every other, they've latched themselves onto every other worthy cause, which is good, but there's not one kind of criticism from a publicly funded, i.e. government funded gallery about the government's handling of COVID. And where it crosses over is where BAME, for want of a better phrase, communities have been inadvertently affected by COVID. And it's government policy that's done that systematically over years. So that's my way of talking about the British art establishment.
Yeah, I would just say I think they're both hugely important in terms of pedagogy and in terms of how we think and talk about art and make art more generally. And I think without going into huge detail, I've been thinking for a while now about what a degree in fine art or painting or studio art might look like if it was going to be truly different, because I don't think altering a reading list and mentioning some different names in lectures is enough. You know, I think it has to go further than that. And so I've been, it'd probably take up too long to talk about the ideas that I'm trying to work on, but I think that would be significant. And then I think, you know, I think we all need to work on ourselves, you know, and I think we need to listen to people. But that's a project that I think for most of us is underway and was underway before last Tuesday in the art world. And I think certainly in art schools, you know, I think it's something that was already at the fore, and I think, I don't know, yeah, I won't talk too much about it, but I think, you know, certainly for me in the past decade, there are increasingly artists from around the world, away from a Western Eurocentric or kind of Atlantic, what do they call it? Europe and America. Anyway, that kind of axis that have been included in my thinking about my own practice and my teaching in the studio. And those artists aren't just contemporary artists. I'm talking about artists that go back sometimes hundreds of years, but certainly to kind of moments in modernism on a regular basis. And that's been an opening up of myself in that period. You know, there was only one person who taught me at art school who spoke about any of that really in any great extent.
I think one of the things in the university that I've noticed in particular in Manchester is that if you're in a position of any position of power, I guess I'm a professor, I was asked, so I'm in the senior staff. So one of the things that I was asked to do recently was to be co-chair of a diversity forum. So I'm middle-aged, I'm middle class, I'm white, I'm heterosexual. I mean, why should I be doing that? So I said no. I still want a voice in there, but you know, why should it be me? You know, I mean, a lot of people are asking the wrong people to be involved, I think, all of the time. I'm not going to name names, but that's one example. What do you do? I mean, I think we just need more people from diverse, for want of a better word, backgrounds in teaching in universities, and it is a problem.
But then, you know, the first thing we need to do is work out how we get, certainly, you know, I mean, on fine art courses has a low proportion of people from ethnic minorities. Right? So the first question is, how do they come in and study? You know, how do people from these communities, or more people from these communities, come in and study? And I think there has to be, you know, more people coming through. That's the, and not, you know, it's not one at the expense of the other. It's kind of both. You know, we need more people teaching. We have some. It's not entirely undiverse at Manchester, and it isn't at most art schools that I know. But that could be better. And then I think also it could be better in terms of the students who are coming through in a city like Manchester, where you look across the city and you look at the population, and it's not reflected. Yeah. Not reflected in the students who come to the art school. That's really important. But then, yeah. Anyway, I'm going to just massive debate. We didn't get around to the value bit properly.
I mean, obviously, this is going to be a series of questions that go on for quite some time, and a discussion that needs to happen and continue continually and on an ongoing basis. So I think that that's something that maybe us that run institutions and are in positions that can facilitate these things can help to happen. I want to try and just come back to some of the questions, just to give because I think it's important that people have opportunity to ask, and there's quite a few rolling in. So I'm going to come back to some of these questions here. Tia Maria Taylor Berry asks, do you believe painting has a performative element? And if so, how does this come into fruition in the curation of work? Short answers, I think now we get.
Yes, but there is a performative element very often in the act of making painting, although I think personally I sometimes try to negate that, maybe not always, but yes, I think there's a performative thing in the making of it. I think I don't know. Well, the bit about curating, I think, is a big question in relation to that would almost need some clarification. But I suppose maybe T is asking, can we relate that performativity through the way the work is encountered to the viewer? And so, I mean, there are lots of artists who have made painting as performance, or video painting as performance, or satire the performative act of painting, or the idea of the painter, thinking of Paul McCarthy, and the kind of performative act in the studio. But I don't know, I think one of the beauties of when you look at a painting is there is kind of performativity in the gesture, is imagining of that it's kind of sited and situated in the work, and that you don't need anything more than the work to see that and to think about that and to understand it. So I think maybe my answer is that curators have an easy job with that, or should have an easy job with that, because it's often in the work.
So speaking as a curator,
one second, you go.
Basically, I'm interested in the idea, in terms of performance, in the idea of temporality in painting. There are two answers. First answer is this idea of time. So the temporal aspect is just multiple. So you've got this idea of the Western history of the Western canon, 600 years worth of years of clock time and history. But then also you've got this idea of Marxist labour time and the market, which Isabella Grohr likes to talk about, I think, as part of her reading. But then you've also got this idea of the surface time of looking at a painting, which can be quick or slow. And I really like all of them put together, this idea of, for me, that's a performance.
And the time of the making, Andy.
The time of the making, exactly, the Marxist labour time. So the idea that, the Ruskin-Whistler argument, the traditional idea.
Well, I think there's something else in that as well. And I think it's, going back to Amber Ward that we were talking before, it's the idea that Amber Ward uses Tom Rabs to talk about this idea that she starts when the painting reaches the beginning that she wanted or something. I can't remember the exact quote, but he says therefore that painting has the ability to go back and forwards in time, which is in the making, right? So that's another argument about time beyond the
it's a kind of Bergsonian durational time, or if you want to get hippie-ish about it, it's that kind of countercultural idea of nature and duration in that respect over father clock time. So I mean, I guess it's not a mourning. I like the affirmation idea rather than mourning, rather than this kind of idea of a fragmented time. It is kind of slowly takes you out of time, or quickly takes you out of time. The other thing I was going to say is that curatorially, traditionally, it's only group shows that are performative in some respect. So you have a theme and you have lots of people who paint,
Can I just say as well, it depends what we mean by performative, because there's that idea, isn't there? You know, I think people use the word performative, but I think it's not just something that we do, it's actually a speech act which commits to something. Right, so yeah, if a speech act is performative, then it commits you to something. So it doesn't just state something. So the famous example, I think it would be when you get married and you say, I do, you're not just making a statement, you're making a binding, you're making a commitment through that speech act. And that is performative. So even the word performative is like not, maybe it's used wrongly sometimes in the art studio. Not that there's not more than one meaning, right? But you know what I mean. Or maybe you don't. Make sure we have the next question, but I don't want to.
Do you know what? I think we're actually out of time.
Oh.
So I'm going to, talking about time, it's a nice little point to wrap up here. And, you know, just to thank you both. What a wonderful way to spend a slightly on the edge of a storm summer's evening, listening to you guys. So thank you very much. And thank you to all our audience who have, again, we've had a big uptake and people have, you know, stayed steady throughout. So obviously we must be talking okay. And I hope you all come back for the next one. So I'm going to say goodbye. We can all wave and do that weird.
Thank you, Miles. Thanks, everyone.
And then it'll cut off really abruptly and we'll all feel lost and slightly strange. So,
can I just say one thing, Miles?
Yeah,
we're having a party afterwards. And a few other people. Shouldn't say this, but maybe there's a way that we can invite other people to come along. What do you think, Magnus?
Yeah, I don't know how. I've not got the code for the. Do you want to do it? Let's see if we can find it. You have to give me a minute.
We'll see if we can figure that out.
Yeah, it'd be nice to keep going, wouldn't it? And have a drink.
Right, I'm gonna cut off.
I'll send you the thing and you can send it, Miles. All right.
Okay.
Thanks, Miles. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Bye, everyone.
Right. So.